Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I've got an interesting guest on stream that I think you guys are really going to enjoy. If you've ever listened to kind of some of the podcasts that are connected to kind of the people I've talked to before, you might have heard of him before. He's a frequent guest on things like the Good Old Boy podcast and What's Left. But Malcolm, thanks for joining me, man.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've heard you speak a number of times before, and I thought, you've got some really interesting things to say, and I thought it would be good for us to have a conversation, but some of my audience may not be familiar with you. So could you maybe introduce yourself a little bit and explain to people kind of what you do and where you're at right now?
Well, I came up in the political left. I was a sort of, revolutionary, communist kiddie, all that stuff. Like you're 20 years old and like you feel like you're not getting ahead or whatever, and then you decide that capitalism is the problem and all we need is a revolution. So like I follow the fairly standard path, I would have to say, for political activists or whatever on the left. Then at some point I basically got cancelled for doing uncomfortable analysis, let's just say. And after that, I would like to say that today I live and work as a professional shit poster, but I guess I'm a sort of political operator in the sphere of populist politics. So I'm involved with the Sweden Democrats as a sort of outside consultant, let's just say, which is the third biggest party, second biggest party in some polls here in Sweden. And then I'm also involved in a smaller sort of populist party from the left called the Örebro Party. And so I kind of work both sides in this sort of populist realignment thing.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because it's certainly something that I've seen a lot online and on Twitter, that kind of thing. You've got two sides that are outside main political power, outside of kind of the what's come to be the traditional policy positions of their sides, left and right, and they're kind of trying to find out kind of where maybe they meet in the middle and maybe not. But it's interesting because everybody's taking a little bit from each other's kind of notebook and seeing what works.
Yeah.
I was interested to ask you. I know I've seen you're not particularly fond of the term post-left, but I think a lot of people have described kind of the group of people who you're often talking to as kind of this post-left, people like yourself who are kind of disillusioned with especially the progressive wing of the progressive part of the left-wing movement, and are kind of looking for something else. Could you maybe explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I might disappoint some listeners here, but I take an extremely dismissive view of like post-leftism. First of all, it was never really a thing. Like the history behind that is essentially that you have this guy called the editor of the Bellows, a guy named Edwin, and the Bellows is this sort of small populist-ish, left populist, labor populist, I guess it could be described as, magazine sort of on the internet. I recommend it. It's got some good articles, including stuff I've written. So, but anyway, he had this sort of header where he posted a bunch of random slogans. And one of the slogans was like towards a post-left or something. And then people sort of jumped at that and say, oh, so you're the post-left now. But the problem with that is just, sure, you could say like a rose by any other name, right? But it's not really a coherent, first of all, it's not a movement and it's not coherent. So it's certainly not a coherent movement. But what we can sort of see today is just that there's on the left, after Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn sort of ran into a brick wall, you had people talking about how did this happen, and I guess you could see a sort of growing analysis today on this space. You could call it the post-left if you want, that you have this fundamental class conflict in society today between PMCs, professionals, whatever term you want to use, and like the 1/3 of America that goes to college versus the 2/3 that do not, essentially.
No, absolutely. And I think increasingly what's interesting about that group, at least what I've noticed, is obviously most of them are getting canceled because they're saying things like, the woke stuff is a distraction. It's just to make sure that you actually don't focus on, real class conflict, that kind of thing. But I've also noticed that they tend to be people who are willing to kind of step outside some of the what has been kind of the left-wing orthodoxy of saying, okay, like families, it's fine if families, kind of get torn apart, and family formation is not that important, and atomization is fine. Like, it's people who seem to be more worried about I guess kind of the things outside of the economic that can also be essential to kind of human flourishing that often doesn't get addressed by kind of the left that is focused so much just on kind of pushing the social justice type mindset. And I think that at least from what I've noticed, that tends to be a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't put a lot of faith in sort of finding a middle ground between the post-left and, the sort of reactionary right, though, for a very simple reason. And that is that most of these people are sort of heading towards a position of political quietism, aka the grill pill, which is what you arrive at when you sort of flail around on Twitter or whatever, posting takes. And then you realize that, you've broadcasted all of these takes out into the cold darkness of deep space, and, nothing really happens. So it's kind of interesting because I sort of came onto the American scene, or whatever you want to call it, as someone who had, at that point, spent the better part of a decade actually trying to build a political institution, like an actual political party. And so I'm not really a good fit with a lot of these sort of post-leftist types, because these are people who relate to politics in a way like, people sort of picking personal brands or a cocktail of ideas or positions that they favor. But that's not really how politics works. Politics is about constituencies. It's about having people who are bound to you in a sort of like a relationship of mutual obligation and loyalty, let's just say, like people with actual names and addresses, voters, workers, and so on. And if you look at the post-left, but also sort of the reactionary right, the big jump that everyone in this like proto-political space eventually has to take, or refuse to take, whatever goes here, is, can I sort of translate my free-floating political ideas into, like, can I operationalize that sort of stuff into actually building something real, like a party, a interest group, a union, and so on? And like, I think that the direction that a lot of people on Twitter and so on invariably head towards is a sort of rejection of like the messy work of politics. Like essentially that they conclude that the terrain doesn't really fit with the map they've drawn up in their head. So, fuck the terrain, essentially.
No, I think you're right that it's that the application is both key and something that a lot of people either are willing to do or don't think is possible. And to be honest, I have my own reservations about what is politically possible, especially in America at this time. I don't. I think you're right that we're probably not going to see some big alliance on like a new center forming or anything like that. Though I am interested in exploring some of the overlap and what different people are, how the different sides seem to be kind of pulling, from each other's kind of bag of ideas and seeing, what fits. But maybe that's part of the problem.
No, it doesn't. It's not really part of the problem. I think that the sort of critical jump that you have to do is like fear is all well and good, but at some point you sort of have to say, oh well, I've sort of discovered the theory of flight, right? Now I actually have to build a plane.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the time, what you see in all of these sort of alternative political environments is people who have a fairly like a self-centered view on like what politics is supposed to do, right? So for them, it's like, I need a group of people because I'm sort of a reject from society. I need to find people that are like me, right? And I need to find like some identity or whatever, some source of validation. But it's really humbling actually to start from scratch and sort of try to build a national party, because if you come from either the left or the right, I would say, you begin with saying, oh well, I've read Marx and I know that the historical task of the international proletariat is to bring about the revolution that will transport us all to communism and a classless society. So this is what I'm going to go out and preach to people about. And then you sort of try to do that and you find people are completely uninterested. And then after a while, you sort of get the hint and ask them, well, what do you want? If it's not, the immediate communist revolution, like, what do you want? And then people start saying really weird fucking stuff to you. Like, these parking meters, like someone should really fix them. And it takes such a long time to sort of unlearn the first instinct, which is to say, what the fuck are you talking about, you stupid prole? Like, parking meters, what the fuck does parking meters have to do with the international proletarian revolution? Do your fucking job. And then you kind of realize that, well, like, who's supposed to be wearing the pants in this relationship, right?
Yeah, I'm somebody who worked for a number of years reporting on local government, and so I sat through about an infinite number of exactly those meetings. And so it is, you'll be surprised how involved people will get in those kind of things. Like you said, the practical stuff that's going to touch their life directly will, people will die on a hill for the correct, parking space or the right name of a town. I couldn't believe it one time a guy managed to drive out more people than I've ever seen in my entire life at a political meeting because he wanted to alter the name of a town slightly. And so, yeah, you're right that when you actually see this kind of stuff in action, it's much different than kind of the high-minded theory. And that is difficult for people to understand where you get started. I mean, I worked in politics, but it was as part of like well-established political parties and stuff. I certainly never, tried to build one from the bottom up. So a lot of that was already kind of, pre-set up. It's already a machine in motion and you're just jumping into the middle of it. It's an entirely different thing to try to build it from the ground up.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, this is what we're talking about here is not necessarily like glorifying discussing zoning laws or parking meters. People are willing to die for that stuff, sure, but they're willing to die for their kids and their country, maybe even for communism. It depends. But people need a reason to fight, and you can't just expect people to be sort of stage extras in a play about yourself. So like the work of politics, and this is something like I had my own reasons for trying to fit in with the sort of American Twitter crowd. And if I'm going to be honest here, it was mostly like these people were useful to build contacts essentially in the US for a while. But I've always kind of recoiled at like a lot of people who think they're being political, who at the end of the day just treat other people as extras in the Truman Show or whatever, like about their own communist struggles or whatever the fuck. And I think that my personal experience lends me to sort of be a lot more bullish on like people on the right than on the left today.
Why do you think that is? What do you think that you're seeing in that that lends you, that maybe gives you that impression?
Because for a lot of people on the right, you kind of see, and I don't mean to sound sort of like overly arrogant about this, but on the right, you see people that sort of repeat all the same mistakes that I and like my sort of comrades were busy committing a couple of years ago, essentially. So you see a lot of people sort of realizing that, okay, well, something is obviously very broken in America today and in the West in general. So we have to do something about that. And then you sort of start unraveling this puzzle, and then it turns out that it's not just about owning the libs on campus. It's actually all of this cultural degeneracy, let's just say. It's deeply tied up into politics. And also, sure, you can sort of you can have a criticism of Pornhub, but banning porn is not going to do shit in a society where there's no sort of material foundations for starting a family. Like, what the fuck are people going to do? Are they going to join like a monastery or something? Yeah, maybe, but they're certainly not going to start families. Like, you need jobs and apartments and stuff like that.
No, I think there's certainly a lot of people who are, and I think some of that is because, for the most part, I think that kind of mainstream conservatives don't see themselves the same way that obviously there were more sections of the left in America that saw themselves as outside the party but pushing left, as where I think conservatives kind of thought the GOP was working in their direction much more. And so it came from a much harder shock for them when they actually kind of pushed back. And I mean, you had like the Tea Party and that kind of thing, but I don't think it was anything compared to kind of what, a lot of the, economic leftists and Bernie bros and that kind of thing. I don't think you had quite that many people on the right who were as disillusioned with mainstream politics up until Trump and then what followed. And so I think a lot of them are just still coming out of that shock. And so they're saying, okay, what do I do? And I think you're right that in many ways, I guess they could be repeating a lot of mistakes of, those on the left who also find themselves outside of the mainstream. But
I don't mean that in that sense that like the right is going to be like failing Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn style. Like I mean something far more sort of trite than that. So one of the examples I can give is that when you start out actually feeling that there's something deeply wrong with society, that you need some sort of extraordinary political forms or movement to solve, you start out thinking that things are not going fast enough. So you see a lot of people today, like in the relationship with the GOP, for example, saying that, oh my God, there's changes happening, but it's so goddamn slow, bro. Like, we might have kicked out like the old guard, like 3 or 4 senators, but not all of them at once. Like, what the fuck, man? But this is kind of like, when you were 10-year-old, you thought that, man, can't time move faster so I can grow up? Like, wouldn't it be really nice if years just kind of skipped? And then once you're a bit older, you think, wouldn't it be really nice if time really slowed down? And once you start building an institution, you kind of realize that, no, things cannot go too slowly. In fact, they can only go far too quickly for you to keep up with. So you see a lot of sort of youthful enthusiasm, which I don't think is anything wrong at all. I think that's kind of phase you have to power through and realize that institutional change, especially when you're talking about a two-party system where all the different sort of factions of a society has to fit into like a huge tent, essentially. Things like, I see a lot of Americans on the right going, oh man, this is happening so slowly, not really realizing that, be careful what you wish on. Like, if you wish on the monkey's paw that things are going to go too fast, like, they probably are going to go faster than you might expect.
Do you really think that there's an opportunity to see big shifts in those institutions? Like, I know obviously you're not based in America, but I'm interested to hear what you think about that. Do you really see the ability of something like the GOP to shift significantly over time?
Yeah, I mean, look, my experience has essentially taught me that for politics, you basically need to look at the motivations driving people rather than like, if you sort of focus on people's ideas, whether they're based or not, you're kind of missing the plot. And what's relevant for the GOP, and I would certainly never sort of try to argue against someone saying that it's filled with cucks and that the rhinos and so on, like, all of that is true. But what's going to force the issue in the US is not whether Mitch McConnell has sort of an awakening after he reads, I don't know, Spengler. Like, no, that stuff, like, even if he does read Spengler, like, that's not the currency that politics trades on. It's just about sort of pressure points and like overarching trends. So the US is actually in a fairly like late empire stagnation crisis situation. I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Peter Turchin, for example.
Not terribly, no, unfortunately. Sorry.
Well, the very Cliff's Notes version is that Peter Turchin is sort of a sociologist, historian, I think. And he has this theory of elite overproduction. Essentially, that means that societies throughout history, they always produce elites. And by elites, we don't mean like Hercules or something like that, a guy with huge muscles or a person who's really smart. We just mean sort of, if you've ever played Victoria, for example, and you have all these different pops. You have like clerks, and then you have capitalists, and you have nobles and officers and soldiers and so on. Like, elites doesn't just means people at the top of society who manage other people, essentially. And society always produces them and always needs them. But now and then, societies tend to overproduce elites, which means that there's too many capitalists, not even capitalists, but like managers, clerks, and there's not enough proles. There's not enough Indians for the chiefs to manage, and there's not enough Indians to economically support the lavish demands of the chiefs. And when that happens, society tends to enter like real crisis mode. And by real crisis mode, I mean like potentially even civil war. Because, yeah.
Yeah, no, I had heard of overproduction of lease. I wasn't familiar with a particular author.
Oh yeah, so he's kind of the guy credited with a lot coming up with the idea originally, I think. But yeah, like the US is kind of in that situation, and at that point, in a sort of elite overproduction situation, I think that Turchin essentially has a sort of Malthusian perspective, which means that like the farmland can only sustain so and so many mouths to feed. And once you get over that, you get a ruthless competition to see who's going to starve. It's like musical chairs. And in the US, what's going to happen is that you're going to have like these overproduced sort of college fail sons who are on the left and, you know, culturally Marxist or whatever the fuck. All of those people have like rational material imperatives, which is that they need to loot the rest of the country. They need to find ways to tax the 2/3 of America that don't go to college. They need to tax small business owners, like liquidate the kulaks, burn down their stores, and get Amazon to sort of sweep in and make everything more efficient, make like, you know, your local tobacco store capable of hiring sort of a black trans femme diversity consultant, which if it's run like a small business, it doesn't have enough surpluses to do. And so like when these conflicts between the like lumpen elites or the overproduced elites and the rest of America get more intense, politicians, especially even if they're cowardly Republicans, don't really have much choice in the matter. I think that, like, if you look at the Republican lineup, it's filled with like spineless opportunists, essentially. But like opportunism, that's kind of what drives politics forwards.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly are seeing. You've certainly seen our culture strip mining pretty much what's left of Middle America to make sure that they can support that overproduction. And you're right that eventually, if things get bad enough, someone who wants to be in power will see that they can seize it by rallying, I guess, kind of the disenfranchised. That's a classic model. I guess I just wonder if that's something that's going to come. I don't know. What I see right now is a lot of people saying, well, the GOP is going to capture, you know, the working class and, you know, all these union workers, and they're going to be the new party of the worker. And I mean, I certainly support the right adopting more favorable, you know, worker-centered politics. But I just wonder, you know, it seems like the plan is to take everybody who's essentially been cast off and completely removed from power, and they're now going to generate a power base. And I just wonder if that's possible. I mean, these people are being actively, you know, made. The only reason the GP has the option to pick them up is they've been jettisoned from the coalition because there's no more power left to squeeze out of them.
I don't think that's true at all. I think the opposite is actually kind of true. These people are not being squeezed out of the coalition because, like, they've been wrung dry. Like if you take Jeremy Corbyn's complete labor disaster, for Labour, like they lost any shot they had at essentially unseating the Tories for 10 years or something like that. But they sort of had to. They had no choice because, like, a lot of the people on the Marxist left that joined Labour were essentially just fucking grad students who said, you know, the job market is awful. Once Jeremy Corbyn gets into government, he's going to make me a commissar of equality or whatever. And so, you know, I'm in it to win it. Like we need to do something for my class of people. Now, obviously, people didn't say this quite as openly. They just said, you know, we need to make me equality commissar in order to help out the poor working class people of the decaying sort of deindustrialized North. And the voters in those districts said, yeah, right, like you're not on our side at all. And they voted for the Tories. And the Tories are sort of stumbling towards kinda, sorta, maybe, like after they exhaust all the other options, they kind of have to try to move money and resources away from these useless college grads towards their own voting base. And you know, that's kind of a winning proposition in the end, because like these overproduced elites, it's kind of a optical illusion to think that they're particularly strong. Like they control like CNN and all of the big media institutions, but how much does that actually count for in terms of actual power?
A lot, I think, especially when you're talking about a country that's spread out across an entire continent and locked in their homes, right? Like I think controlling messaging and narrative is pretty powerful when people don't have the ability to interact with each other on a regular basis. And I think basically having your hands on basically the controls of every form of communication that's regularly available to people is pretty powerful. I think more so now than it's ever been. I understand it's not the only thing, but I don't think it's nothing.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a piece on this issue called "For American Greatness." I think it's called something like Our Class. I can't even remember the title, but let me Google it. Because it kind of speaks to a fairly significant point here. Oh yeah, the piece is called "Our Coddled Elites and All the Pain They Can't Feel." And a sort of quick rundown of the argument is actually that if you look at how religious ideas spread, and as based Carl Schmitt pointed out, all religious or all political concepts are just sort of second-hand theological concepts.
Yeah, there's secularized theological concepts. Yeah.
And all religions spread not through the printing press necessarily, or through telegrams or books. Successful religions, and there's a really good book on this called like the Rise of Christianity by something Stark. But his argument is essentially that early Christianity was so successful, one, because it sort of spoke to the material needs of people, while like all the ancient sort of Roman cults did not. So he has sort of a class analysis, like not a Marxist class analysis, but he ties it to the material in some ways. But then he also says that the mode of transmission for religious ideas is actually through human, like social interactions. And so by that, he means that the way that people adopt ideas, whether religious or political, is that they sound out their own sort of social proximity. Like, what does my family, what does my potential like mating pool feel like? What do my friends think? And then they sort of subconsciously weigh the costs and benefits of, adopting this new idea.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot less sort of, oh, well, after rubbing my fedora and giving this some serious thought, like I've decided on this because it corresponds with facts and logic. No, that's not how it happens. People become Christians or they become Mormons because all their friends are Mormons. The reason this is relevant is because if you look at social media and like cable news, these things are one-way communication streets. they're basically a guy and on Twitter and so on, which is completely worthless, politically speaking, by the way. Like, you shouldn't spend time and resources on it. You're approached by people with names like Marx Fiddler 6969, who says, you should really become an Albanian socialist. And that leaves no impression. Like, sure, you can become an Albanian socialist because Turbofucker told you to, but there's no sort of cost benefit like analysis that goes into that on the social level. And the thing is, like, religions tend to spread even against sort of state repression, because people talk to their family members, they talk to their co-workers, they sort of discuss, say, the election, for example. Like, how powerful was the sort of the moratorium on the information quarantine? It was completely fucking useless. Something like 70-80% of of Republican voters think that the election was stolen, regardless of what CNN and Twitter said and all of the bannings they carried out. Why? Because people got their information from, asking their boomer uncle, is this normal? Do counting stations just say, oh, well, we're not going to count the votes for a week or whatever. Don't ask us why. And that boomer uncle said, no, I think there's something funny going on. And so, again, the objective of the enemy here, in terms of the electoral fraud discussion, was to make sure that nobody believed that electoral fraud was real. And they completely failed. Again, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. So I agree entirely with what you're saying about how ideas generally spread. Yeah. I think that's right, and I think that you're right that the increased kind of need for open exercise of power with the media makes it more fragile and makes more likely that people will seek information outside developing the phenomena that you're talking about there. So I think you're right that that does happen. I think the problem is let's properly phrase this. First, we need to understand that if you want something to change, and you need to have those social connections. And like you said, you have them by talking to your friends, by talking, to someone you're dating, by going to, people you spend time with in churches, or hang out with people at a club or whatever. But what happens if those don't exist, right? Like, what happens if you don't have those connections? What happens if, as it is with so many people, those connections are almost entirely impossible, and increasingly so? I don't think you'll ever completely remove that form of the human experience, and I think eventually people will push back against our continued move in that direction. But I don't think we're going to see things break free quite as quickly as we would, or in quite the way we would have traditionally, because of some of the limitations of the ability to have those conversations and those interactions on a regular basis.
Just give me 1 second. I need to get up from the computer for like 10 seconds.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I think he's being attacked by like a rubber chicken in the background or something. But guys, remember, if you want to ask questions, I'm sure we'll take a few of those at the end. Here, also make sure to check out his Twitter and his blog. I've got those linked below in the description.
So yeah, I'm back.
Okay, yeah, I was wondering what was attacking you back there.
Yeah, it's a long story. I have sort of a faulty computer fan on my laptop, and it was driving me wild, so I had to sort of shut it off. Anyway, you put up like an interesting scenario. I'm kind of not sure how how much is new under the sun here, truly. And again, if we sort of talk about blue state America versus red state America, red state America has much more intact social connections.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the huge problem with that the libs, if you excuse the colloquialism, like the big problem the libs are facing is that their writ does not run really far outside of the coasts and these sorts of coastal or coastal transplant cities. Because again, if you grow up in like, you know, flyover country, people, those connections, like you have your friends, they're your friends because they're your friends. It's not like at Harvard or whatever, where people who are your friends are your friends because you can get like something resembling career advancement out of exploiting them. So again, if you're kind of hoping for atomized pod people who live in this sort of ghost in the shell cyberpunk reality, you're not going to find that among the people who don't go to college nearly as much as the people who do.
Yeah, that's true for sure. But as somebody who's lived in flyover country most of my life in America and fairly familiar with, especially kind of the deep South, which is supposed to be fighting all of these trends, I see more and more of it. Like, don't get me wrong, like we're in better shape than New York or LA or something like that, and it's certainly true that you still see far more organic communities. But they're devastated. I mean, they're strip mined out. You've pulled anybody who could help these communities out into the IQ shredders in the cities, and the people who are left are atomizing on their own. You're right that they're not having friendships only to climb or whatever because they don't see an opportunity to climb. They're sitting at home and ODing on fentanyl and watching Netflix. Like it really is not. I think if there are any communities that are going to survive, I think it's the ones you're talking about. But when I hear people say, "Oh well, but in the heartland, America's fine," I don't think that's true.
No. I would never say that America's fine in the heartland. You have the same dynamic here, with to a much lesser extent in some ways, but it's still obvious where the parts of Sweden that aren't on the coasts and aren't, cool progressive metropoles, they're basically left to rot and die. And some of them with our immigration catastrophes are just like a horror show. But even with that said, the point here is not so much that, oh wow, we can all do the Benedict option in bumfuck nowhere, Arizona. No, you can't. But in terms of what sort of people will be politically powerful, like potent, you don't need people to be. You don't need people to live in sort of trad, one family houses surrounded by white picket fences. Like there's a good series of books called like a Swedish worker's memoirs that was useful to me when I came to be in politics. And I gave that to my friend, who's now a sort of post-left populist party leader. But those books were written in Sweden back when Sweden was a really fucking poor country. And the level of social dysfunction during the early stages of industrialization, and again, like 1915, that's not even the worst parts anymore, you can't really even comprehend them today. Like, sure, there's fentanyl in flyover country, like Appalachia. Like, a lot of that looks like hell on earth. Sure, whatever, but none of that compares to the worst parts of England during the 1800s. The thing is, like, if you look at, like, people dig up old bones and sort of see, well, okay, this was a male and this person was suffering from malnutrition and so on. The part where you find, like, the most sort of evil malnutrition is not, oh, well, during the Middle Ages, God, things sucked. No, like, the most sort of distressed human remains you will find are from the early period of industrialization. People just sort of, here in Sweden at one point, it was kind of a fad to, like, if you worked on a quarry or something, you could get your hands on dynamite. So what you would do is you would stick a stick of dynamite in your mouth and you would light it and you would blow your head off, literally. People did that shit on the street. It was really, really bad. But and so, yeah, sure, the US is really, really bad, and it might even get just as bad as Sweden or the US in 1910. But we already know that Sweden or the US in 1910 is not really a condition that sort of precludes political organizing, right? Like, we got from there to where we were during the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I guess there's a couple things there. One is, one of my concerns probably is that material conditions are able to stay high enough to where people simply don't get pushed that direction. And this is not me saying, like, oh boy, I really hope things get bad enough to where people, like, change. Like, no, I don't want things to get worse. But I think one of the things that does kind of create the soft landing is the ability for people to continue in, what would be relative comfort, while also having, kind of the soul of the country strip mined out. Like, I think a purely material analysis kind of falls down there.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And so that's one thing that really concerns me. I mean, yeah, I don't think the system is, I don't think things can continue in that manner forever either way. But I do think that saying, well, just because things don't get as materially bad, like, it's, that won't be an issue. I don't know if that's exactly right. I think you also have a problem where you also have a reach of just basic mechanisms. Like, you can get into debate on what happened with the election, but we had a Time magazine article that made it very clear that it was fortified, right? Like, they couldn't even stop themselves from writing the article. And so with them taking a victory lap in public like that, what does political organization look like in a system in which the elites who have control over those levers are willing to gloat about how basically electoral politics is not an option and won't be?
I think that the field of politics in general is one where you get a lot of people who sort of they go with their gut, like those that meme where it's a distribution curve, and then you have, like, the Grug Wojaks on one end saying, like, with their 50 IQ, well, I just follow my feelings, I know immigration is bad. And then you have the midwit saying, well, I have this study that says immigration is really good for the economy. And then you have, like, the geniuses with huge brains and 160 IQ saying, actually, immigration is bad. Well, I mean, with politics, you sort of get a lot of those grugs saying, well, my feeling is that revolution, it works like this because, I looked into my cornflakes this morning or whatever. But it's actually, when we're discussing sort of social and political upheaval, this is one of those areas that are majorly counterintuitive in a lot of ways. Like if you go with your gut, you're not going to be right like 50% of the time. So the reason I bring that up is not a sort of jab at you, but rather that what I've found helpful is in sort of thinking through all of these things is to actually go, well, what has happened historically? That's a really good place to start with when discussing these things. And I think I kind of have to recommend a podcast that's literally called the Revolutions Podcast.
Oh yeah, no, that's good.
Because it's sort of, I think that the sort of the guy who has the podcast, Mike Duncan, does a pretty good job of getting into the weeds and sort of illustrating just how messy something like the French Revolution is, and just how much incompetence and hubris goes into that. And so for me, the American revolution, or the American situation now, it's basically like classically pre-revolutionary, in that, to borrow from James Burnham's Machiavellians, elites ruled by myths and lies, like nice little stories that sort of convince people that, well, the elites are there because they're the smartest and, God has chosen them or whatever. And then at some point, like the energy, the believability goes out of the lies. At that point, politicians rule through fraud, open fraud. And they only rule through open fraud for a while, because people don't accept fraud in general. Like, this is a transitionary state, after which politicians rule through naked force. And once you get to the naked force part, like, things are not great in the US. This might get us in real trouble with the sort of for YouTube, FBI, alphabet soup authorities. But I have to sort of speak my piece here. I don't think maternity flight suits are how you sort of build an air force, let's just say. Like, you don't put the pregnant women in the planes. I know this might come as a shock to you, my American friend and interlocutor, but no, just no. And I don't give much credit to, bringing in the trannies or the non-gendered space fairy, whatever, new males. Like, a military, it's going to be fairly conservative white males.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's certainly been the traditional case, especially with the forward-facing units in the United States military. There's a pretty big demographic difference between your frontline units and your support units in the United States. But that's also why we've seen the heavy purges and kind of the increased focus on the intersectional intersectional nature of the force, which of course has also only made it has woken up a surprising number of kind of classical conservatives as to what's going on. They're pretty much always on board with the military, and amazingly Tucker Carlson and the DoD getting us about Tucker Carlson might have red-pilled more conservatives on the military than literally anything else ever could have.
Yeah, this is kind of what I mean by the sort of, when you're wet behind the ears, you think that everything is going too slowly, and then when you sort of are at the game for a while, you sort of curse at reality, saying, oh man, things are moving far too quickly. Because just think about what that fucking means. The fact that in a couple of years, like less than half a decade, the political scene in the US has completely transformed. The Schmittian sort of boundaries between friend and enemy have been upended completely. That can actually accelerate. It can go even quicker than this.
Well, and one of the things that, to go back what you were talking about with Burnham, he's taking Pareto's, residues there. and talking about how you come to be dominated by the foxes who are ruling by lies and fraud. And he points out, like you said, that once the kind of the lies and the fraud fail, then they go to naked force, but they're bad at it because they're not lions. They're not people who are familiar with this kind of power and how to use it properly and justly. And so that's going to have some pretty bad downstream effects, right? That's not to be clear, we're not talking about people standing and looking intimidating in front of the White House. And so I think you're right that things could go that way. I think it's entirely possible that things could go that way. But that doesn't really lead us to worrying about the proper form of community political organization, I guess, is my concern, right? If we think that's a likely outcome. I mean, and that's my biggest concern,
How do you mean, like, worrying about the proper forms of?
Well, you're just saying, like, because there's these things don't preclude political organization. You were saying, the situation being bad doesn't preclude political organization and influencing and building, political parties and that kind of thing, which is true. But when we're in this kind of this late empire rule of the foxes desperately going towards kind of breaking down with myths and that kind of thing, my worry is that basically nothing allows for that. Like, basically the system does not allow for that organization, period. Which I feel like is increasingly looking like it's going to be the case.
And I mean, the problem here is just that, in terms of my experience in Sweden, for example, is that on the surface level, this holds true. Getting into, even with the sort of proportional representation system, politics moves like molasses. It's really slow, and there's a lot of institutional barriers and so on thrown up towards new actors. But the problem is just that, how should I put this? Empires are never felled by revolutionaries being strong. That has never, ever happened.
Yes, yeah.
They only fall because they're weak. And revolutionaries in general kind of adopt this sort of play acting. So Lenin himself, for example, said, just less than a year before the October Revolution broke out, that, the October Revolution, we're going to wait, 50 years or whatever for our next shot at this game. And he was as surprised as everyone else when that wasn't true, even though the signs were there. Like, you had the First World War, it was going terribly for Russia, you had all of the problems in the 1910s. So a sort of informed observer could say that, the risk of something revolutionary breaking out, it's actually fairly high. But when you're in that, you tend to become sort of snowblind to just how real those realities are, let's just say. And the corollary to this is just that, for someone who actually wants to change something, or who fancies himself a positive political force, or a revolutionary political force, or a reactionary political force, whatever, someone who wants to stage an intervention in that sort of blind process of history, your job tends to be to run and run and run as quickly as you can to catch up with events. And if you're really smart, you sort of prepare in advance, and you tie your shoelaces, so to speak. You get your running shoes in order, and you prepare your cadres and whatever. And even if you do a bang-up job of doing all that preparation, you're still going to be running as quickly as you can to catch up. And for us, what this has meant is that, sure, the getting into parliament, that takes a lot of time. Can't do that in a couple of years. But the Sweden Democrats, it took them something like 15 years or something from when they started to when they got into parliament. And for us, our project is essentially to contest areas where there's no sort of smothering blanket of total oppression, which is the local level. And this is where the writ does not run. Again, you say that essentially the system in the US precludes any organized resistance, or that it feels like it does. But again, that's because you're not really looking too closely. Because for a lot of local seats, to state legislatures and to even some sort of states senatorial seats, or congressional seats, I need to say, because the two are not the same. For even some congressional seats, the Eye of Sauron doesn't have time. It just does not have the time, the energy, the forces to bring the hammer down. So at the local level, democracy actually can matter. Organization can actually matter. And that's what you sort of contest. And you don't really contest local levels necessarily just because, once I have all of these local seats, I'll control the state legislature and then I'll be almighty. Well, you might actually end up controlling the state legislature, and that's nothing to sneeze at. But even the process of doing so will actually, just like in a Japanese computer game, fighting all of those monsters, doing the work, will give your cadre valuable experience.
No, that's actually a good way to explain that. I think that's probably the best explanation I've had for why that's useful. It's even if you're not gaining the kind of power that'll allow you to make a significant institutional change, simply training yourself to be politically minded and to be to have that skill set, to have that organization is in itself useful, and that's probably a pretty good point.
Yeah, and also it's sort of non-line. It's, you can't really predict how useful it will be, and I can give another sort of practical example of this. So the Örebro Party has, at this point, in terms of reach and name recognition, and this we have to point out, it's a very small political party. It only got a couple of thousand votes in the municipal elections of 2018. So essentially it got 3% of the vote in a mid-sized, or like on the larger side, Swedish municipality. So that's not nothing, but it's not very much. With that said, in politics, what often matters is not necessarily how big you are, but at what sort of compound interest you are able to grow. So if you triple your results every election cycle, you're going to get somewhere fairly quickly. And that's exactly what we ended up doing. And I think there's a lot of indications that we're going to triple our election results for 2022. And you only need like another cycle of that to essentially control the municipality. But the local level is not necessarily what I want to stress here. It's that one of the most interesting experiences here is actually the fact that Facebook, compared to every other sort of social media channel, is incredibly useful. And I think you can sort of apply that to Parler and Gab and those kinds of platforms too. Because what we sort of realized, and social media has been a hot button issue for politicians in Sweden for a while. So you have the major parties, they're always trying to come up with like fancy new social media campaigns, and they have a lot of money to invest. At this point, our shitty little municipal party has probably like the second widest reach of all the parties after the Sweden Democrats, with a non-existent budget, because we sort of tapped into a hidden vein of boomer magma. And again, this ties into what we talked about earlier, which is that religious ideas, they spread through social connections and a sort of cost-benefit analysis that humans do based on their sort of social environment. So what ended up happening is that in municipal debates in Sweden, like most municipalities record them. And some guy just put out like videos, which again, the municipality does. So we didn't buy any equipment or anything, but some guy, some random dude started putting out debate videos of the party leader, Marcus Allard, essentially lambasting the others, you know, doing the populist greatest hits, talking about social democrats essentially spending nothing on actual workers and just shunting money to period blood artists, shit like that. And this just blew up. People started linking it to their friends and uncles and so on. And then suddenly you have like a video from, again, like a municipal debate, not very important, you would think, with like 1 million views in a country of 10 million people. And again, what you really start to figure out, because a lot of knowledge in politics, it's you begin with the apple falling on the head, like that famous sort of I can't, you know, Thomas
Isaac Newton.
Yeah, Newton. Sorry, Newton sitting there, getting the apple on his head, and oh well, I guess I'll have to discover gravity now to figure to explain what just happened. Politics works like that. You know, something happens, and then you sort of have to come up with a theory for it. And again, if you had sort of said, well, okay, I'm going to wait until the revolution happens, and then I'm going to dive headfirst into politics, what you would have ended up doing would be what everyone else was doing at that point, which is to spend a lot of money on Instagram, where again, interactions are anonymous between people who work under pseudonyms, at which point this sort of religious broadband effect is lost. But everyone was, in their conventional wisdom, sort of just say, oh, well, Facebook, it's just a bunch of cringe boomers, man. All the cool kids are on fucking, I don't even know, like, what's that cancerous bullshit? TikTok. All the kids from TikTok, dude, like, if you want to be political, you need to be on TikTok, bro. Again, yeah, you can get a bunch of sort of communists in Bangladesh or whatever saying, oh man, cool, I really dig your video on communism, bro. Those people aren't going to vote for you. So I bring this up just to illustrate how chaotic and messy politics, once you sort of get into the weeds, tend to be, but also how, again, you never have enough time because it's all about experimenting and then building all of these institutions. So when we figured out that actually we have a media campaign that is free, we don't have to pay anything, and people will do, like, your sort of presumptive voters will do the work for us gladly. Then we started exploiting that, obviously. But again, you're not going to discover this unless you sort of experiment, unless you do practice before theory in a way.
Yeah, and ironically, that's what Spangler said too. But yeah, no, I agree. I think a lot of people are too hesitant to try to build because they say, "Oh, this is going to get crushed," or "It's going to be ineffective because of this or that," and they just end up with analysis paralysis. And if even if it does get crushed, even if it is shut down, even if something doesn't work about it, simply having the experience and having gotten those trial runs out of the way is itself very beneficial, and probably something that's well worth keeping in mind.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
I just wanted to sort of respond to a guy in the comments here who said that, well, all of this is fine and dandy, but local level doesn't really matter because the federal power is now so overwhelming that nothing is close to what it was even 20 years ago. And again, this is kind of on its face, this seems like a very convincing argument, but that's never really how power works. First of all, it's always kind of local, and it's kind of a pyramid in a way. Like back when the US party system actually worked, you had local machines. And local machines were just, ethnic groups, interest groups, churchgoers, whatever. All of these sort of collated together and then run by a party boss who weighted the pros and cons of different groups as requests and demands, and sort of passed along the signals from the ground up to the mid-level and then up to the top level. It's kind of like that scene in Godfather, where the guy comes in and says, "I have a problem. Please, can you help me?" And he gets the reply, "So you come and ask me for help on my daughter's wedding day," and it's all like, "Oh, sure, I'll help you if you remember to do me a favor." That's how the Social Democrats, for all their socialism, all their theory, they worked like that. And this is how politics works. You cannot have a functioning political institution without having that on the local level.
Well, I think that's true when you're building, but I think I don't know if you're familiar with Bertrand de Juvenal, but he's got a good book on power, and one of the things he points out is that as power expands, it begins on these local levels, but you get the centralization arms race, and in order for the king or the bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., whatever you want, for them to generate more power in the process, they need to gut these local institutions and make their their power bases instead loyal to them. They need to basically topple these regional actors and find ways to make those constituents loyal to them.
Yeah.
And so I think you're right that's where things started, and it's where things I think will probably end up again. But I think we're in that moment where we've seen the federal system basically shredded, and those regional power bases are significantly less powerful than they've ever been, because so much of it has been centralized.
Here you kind of have to maintain proper perspective, just like with the sort of holy crap, things are so bad because fentanyl. Like, yeah, they're really bad, but again, they're nothing compared to what used to be normal during the turn of the century. And here, Sweden is a unitary state, essentially since the time of the King Gustav Vasa. So we're talking 14th century. Ever since that time, maybe even earlier, the major goal of the Swedish kings has been to sort of centralize power into a functional state that could wage permanent war, because that's what we used to like doing. And centralization has been the name of the game. Like, you don't have the founding fathers saying, well, a real good republic is one where people should be allowed to sort of live out their lives in pursuit of happiness, and we should have the federal state to handle some things and local levels to handle some things. No, fuck you. The king should rule over everything. That's the attitude these people had when they built our institutions. And the Social Democrats, my oh my, the Social Democrats were not fans of localism. And they didn't need to be, because the Social Democrats were a single party state. From the 40s until like the 70s. It was one country, one party. So Sweden is purpose-built for what you're talking about, like total centralization, what the local level says shouldn't matter. Fuck you, local politicians. You should just shut up and listen to the orders from Stockholm. Even if you build a society like that, that's not how it works. There's a really interesting guy, a leader of or sort of a profile in the moderate party called Christian Sonesson. And he has essentially a little fiefdom that he runs down in southern Sweden. And this fiefdom is named Staffanstorp, and it used to be just a joke. Essentially, people joked about Staffanstorp being the sticks. Now it's become sort of a prestigious place to move to. And the interesting thing about this guy is that he comes from an old sort of political aristocrat, basically an aristocratic political family. Like his brother is has a bunch of like high up political appointments and so on. So it runs in the family. He's no salt of the earth type of guy. But the thing is, this guy got really well known in Sweden during the immigration crisis. Why? Because the immigration crisis was basically the central state saying, fuck you, local areas. We're going to take in, 1 million migrants or whatever, and you're just going to have to deal with it. Don't tell us that you can't afford it, whatever. We don't care. We're the central government. We do whatever we want. And they kind of just sort of shunted them out there. And here in Sweden, the central state government paid for, benefits, social security for migrants for 2 years. And then they said, you're on your own, even though they knew that it took maybe 15 years on average for a migrant to actually become financially independent. And so this guy, Sonesson, what he does is essentially he tells the central government, fuck you. I am going to do what's in the interest of my constituency, which is the voters of Staffanstorp. They have elected me to represent their interests. If you send me a ton of migrants, I'm going to put them in mobile homes until they move out. And everyone said, this is totally illegal. You can't do that. And he did it anyway. At this point, he has sort of North Korean levels of support. Like, he runs the entire municipality. And again, this is in a system where you're not supposed to be able to even do that kind of crap. You're not supposed to be able to say on the local level, our constituency says this and this and this. This is what we're going to do. The US is built for that kind of crap.
Yeah, and interestingly, COVID, as much as it's a problem, is also something that highlights this. You have guys like DeSantis in Florida, which are probably going to have that kind of following after all this, just because, basically the same thing. Just like, I don't care. I'm not closing stuff down. You can't. You want to come and close it? Then let's roll the tanks, because otherwise it's not getting done.
Yeah, exactly. Sonesson is essentially like a turbo DeSantis. He just told like the central government, well, you can roll in the tanks and sort of arrest me, but until you do, I'm not going to back down. And the central government huffed and puffed, and then they realized that, like, they're not going to sort of cut the electricity to all of his voters to sort of punish him. He's only going to end up being even more popular if that happens. So they kind of said, we're going to see you in court in 3 years, and we're going to force you to pay a fine that you're going to refuse to pay. That's 100th of what you saved on not taking in these immigrants. And he's done that crap with like a ton of stuff. So he sort of said, I'm going to go out and hire, I'm not allowed to hire police officers because that's not within my jurisdiction. So I'm going to hire sort of private security guards. And they're going to do all the sort of jobs that police officers are supposed to do. They're going to patrol the streets and keep people safe. And if you say, I can't do this, well, fuck you. See you in court. And even if you win in court, I'm just going to do it anyway.
Yeah, and when people see that work and succeed, it certainly puts a chink in the armor.
Yeah, and once that happens, suddenly you have people who will fight to the death to protect you. Again, this guy has like 50% of the votes in a proportional representation system. 50% of the vote that basically never happens in this country.
Mm-hmm. No, it's definitely a good point, and I think that, like I said, especially with the current situation, it only highlights clearly when those kind of victories are won. But we could probably do this part forever. I know that one thing you wanted to talk about was kind of the social situation in South Korea. And I don't want us to run too long. So did you want to get into that before we run into time?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that the reason the social situation in South Korea is interesting, with like it's completely bottom out fertility rates and so on, is because it illustrates in a way that wokeness is just essentially another way for this overproduced elite to deal with the fact that they're overproduced. So people tend to think on the right that, well, we can win this culture war if we just come up with better ideas. We can totally beat back these Satanists who don't want us to have kids. But again, like, wokeness is in the US, it's their way of hyper competition. So in Korea, you study for 20 hours in order to get into university. In the US, you don't study for 20 hours, but you sharpen your knives and you just sort of find old tweets of people to get them disbarred from college so you can take their spot. But it's all sort of birds of a feather in terms of hyper competitiveness. And the right is going to face a real sort of rude awakening when they realize that what they're bargained for or what they've signed up for, it's an actual sort of class war. If you want proper families, like a trad lifestyle and so on, you can't really win with facts and logic. You sort of have to, you really have to address the fact that the structure of our society is one that produces a middle class, whether in South Korea or in the US, that can't reproduce itself.
Like quite literally cannot reproduce itself at all. No, it's something that was big change for me when I kind of woke up out of the kind of the neocon slumber, was that the vast majority of my society was engineered to make sure that it can't continue itself forward. And I think that is something that more of the right is understanding as you see kind of this general shift away from, just kind of blindlessly, saying, yeah, corporations are good because free market and whatnot. But I don't think they maybe understand how fundamentally kind of the meritocracy would need to change in order to kind of enable that, and how much of that is people protecting kind of their own interests and the kind of their privilege inside, the social class for achieving particular markers of status when it comes to college and such.
Yeah, the thing about a lot of especially disgusting boomers like Jordan Peterson, like a thing with a lot of these people is that they have this sort of, well, I mean, why can't we all be friends, right? Sure, these Satanists are preaching that we shouldn't have kids or whatever, or that pedophilia is not really so bad, and maybe we should just castrate all our kids because they might be trans. But at the end of the day, if you want to fight this, you kind of have to realize that castrating all the kids and being Satanists is just American Confucianism. And the problem here is that this sort of class that's kicking away the ladder, trying to be a parasite on the productive economy, saying, well, we can't send money to white farmers. How would that look? That would further white supremacy. We can only do it to sort of black trans farmers. We're going to take money from white farmers and give it to POC and indigenous farmers. And in fact, if you're a white farmer, fuck you. We're going to repossess your farm or whatever. You've had it too good for too long. These people, they are not doing this because they're evil. The fact that they are evil is sort of irrelevant to the broader point. They're doing it because it's the only way to reproduce themselves. Like, they're basically, like, imagine medieval guilds. Those artisans at the end of the guild system, they're not really fighting to, we really need to bring quality shoes to the people. That's why we need the shoemakers guild. No. They're fighting to make sure that they don't become workers in a shoe factory. When that happens, like, they've lost their entire sort of privileged position. It doesn't really matter if shoe factories are just objectively better ways of making sure that people can afford shoes.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that, and I think it's something that the right certainly needs to take in. I don't know that I'm less bullish on, like, just properly reordering economic concerns solves problems. And I don't mean that, I understand the economic incentives and the structural incentives are incredibly important and certainly need to be part of the discussion. And you're right that much of this is motivated by these people just desperately trying to avoid the fate of falling into classes that they have seen as kind of unwashed. But at the same time, I think there is a spiritual component. I think there is something deeper than just, if we can just get the economics reordered, because I don't think you even care about getting the economics reordered until you can get people to care about this stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think that has to be part of it too. I think people have to they have to understand, like, no, like, having families, having close-knit communities, having social fabric is worth your time, and that's something that has, I think, deeply fallen out of kind of the American consciousness at this point. And so I think what you're saying is essential to the project. I don't think it's the only thing. And that is the one thing that I sometimes see is, kind of people who are, kind of come from the left will often be like, well, if you just, if you reorder the economic incentives properly and put the class, analysis spin on it, then it all kind of writes itself. And I think it's kind of a both and on that one.
Yeah, I think that this is another thing that makes me far more bullish on the right and the left, because both of you have a huge deviation, but yours is acute and the left's is chronic. And by that, I just mean that for the left, they really a lot of the time have this sort of, oh well, culture isn't real. Culture is just a spook, dude. Like, come on, sort of whether you live under sort of a Islamic theocracy or not, that doesn't matter. That's just sort of identity politics if you care about that. The only thing you should care about is the number on your bank account. And, that's incurable, that sort of retardation. I think the mistake that you make, which is very much curable, is that you sort of artificially separate out these things, which is understandable given the position of the left. It's that, well, one culture is unreal and economics is real, and those are the two categories. Here, the problem is just that if you think about something like the Boxer Rebellion, if you're familiar with that,
mm-hmm.
The way you sort of build a movement is obviously not just saying, oh, well, what if we raise the sort of earned income tax credit? And then you have this perfect technocratic solution and politics is now over. Obviously, that doesn't work. If you want to win, whether you're a sort of Christian or a communist or a peasant millenarian or whatever, you really need to build your cadre, however you define it. And building your cadre is not just about meat and potatoes. It's about fuel for the spirit, so to speak. And this is, again, something which it's kind of really inexcusable that the left is so decadent and bad, even sort of dissident leftists, that they don't just listen to all of, say, like every fucking socialist sort of well-known song that's ever been written. This is just sort of Christian iconography with the serial numbers filed off, my friend. And Spengler famously commented that, Bolshevism or Christianity is the grandmother of Bolshevism, essentially. And, in a way, that's true. Old Bolshevism had the same sort of fuel that it ran on, the same sort of themes.
Yeah, well, what Spengler was saying there was that he says that every animating spirit, every spirituality of a civilization ends up with its own particular atheism. And he says that socialism is the atheism of Christianity, in the same way that the Stoics were the atheists of the Roman pagans. That basically it's just the secularization of the ethos, stripping out the spirituality.
Yeah, but the thing is, I wouldn't say that it strips out like the spirituality. It strips out like the metaphysical in the formal sense.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But what this does, in a way, ironically, is that it's sort of the last. It's like wringing the last sort of toothpaste out of the tube, in a way, because the Bolsheviks had no problem finding martyrs for the faith. Like, people were willing to die for that crap.
No.
And again, like you don't die because for Richard Dawkins, like, oh man, this book, it's so rational, dude, I'm gonna die for it. No, that doesn't happen. But it's kind of like, you can die for America, you can die for freedom, for patriotism, which in some ways just recycle in a sort of with less overt metaphysical claims, but it's still the same sort of process in the end. And again, this tends to happen at a point where people have lost faith in organized religion. Then they become sort of religious fanatics for organized atheism. And then eventually even that runs out, and then a civilization is really at its last ropes until you get the new religiosity.
Yep. No, that's certainly a process that Spangler outlines, for sure. But that said, guys, we're coming up on, well, actually, we're past an hour and a half. So we're probably going to go ahead and wind this up. If you do have any questions, you can get those in right before we go. But I want to say thank you to Malcolm for coming on. I think it's been a really good conversation with some places I didn't expect, but I think those were pretty good. And also, make sure that you are checking out his Twitter and his blog and everything that I have linked.
You really don't need to check out my Twitter or my blog, because if you check out my Twitter, you're just going to get my shit posts. So, I mean, if that's what you're into, bro, like, I won't judge.
What else is Twitter for? I don't trust anybody who uses Twitter for anything else.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks for coming by, guys. Really appreciate it. If you haven't subbed to the channel yet before, please make sure you do so. And thanks for watching. And as always, we'll talk to you next time.